The shuttle was falling apart around her, and Grace knew she had maybe 30 seconds to live. Alarms screamed in her ears. Red lights flashed across every screen. The engine had exploded somewhere behind her, and now the small craft was spinning through the atmosphere of 4 like a leaf in a storm. Grace pulled hard on the controls and tried to level out. The trees below were coming up fast. Too fast. She braced herself against the seat and closed her eyes, and then there was a terrible sound of metal hitting wood, and everything went black. When Grace opened her eyes again, the sun had moved across the sky. Hours had passed. Her head was pounding, and there was blood on her face from a cut above her eye. She tested her arms and legs slowly. Nothing broken. That was a miracle. The shuttle was not so lucky. It lay crumpled against a massive tree trunk with smoke rising from its ruined engine. Grace crawled out through a gap in the hull and stood on shaking legs in the alien forest. The trees here were enormous. Their trunks were wider than houses, and their branches reached so high she could barely see where they ended. The leaves were deep purple, and the light that filtered through them gave everything a strange violet glow. Grace had studied 4 in the database. It was a forest moon orbiting a gas giant. The survey teams had marked it as low priority. No intelligent life. Just plants and animals and nothing worth exploring. Grace checked her equipment. Her communication device was destroyed. Her emergency beacon was crushed. She had her sidearm, her knife, a small medical kit, and enough food rations for maybe 5 days if she was careful. The research vessel Starling was in orbit somewhere above her, but they would not start looking for at least a day. Standard protocol. Shuttles sometimes went silent during atmospheric surveys. It happened. They would wait before sending a rescue team. She needed to survive until then. Grace set up a small camp near the shuttle. She used pieces of the hull to build a shelter and collected water from a stream she found nearby. The scanner on her wrist still worked, and it told her the water was safe to drink. Small victories. As the sun began to set and the purple shadows grew longer, Grace sat by her shelter and listened to the sounds of the alien forest. Birds that were not really birds sang in the branches above. Insects that were not really insects hummed in the undergrowth. And somewhere in the distance, something was crying. Grace froze. The sound was soft and high and full of pain. It sounded like a puppy, or a kitten, something young and scared and alone. Every rule in the xenobiology manual told her to ignore it. Unknown alien creatures could be dangerous. Unknown alien young could have parents nearby who would kill to protect them. The smart thing to do was stay in her shelter and wait for rescue. But Grace had never been very good at ignoring something that was hurting. She took her sidearm and her flashlight and followed the sound through the darkening forest. It led her down a slope and across a small clearing and finally to a massive tree with roots that rose from the ground like walls. There was a gap between 2 of the roots, a den, and inside the den the crying was louder. Grace knelt down and shone her light inside. 3 small creatures looked back at her. They were about the size of puppies, but they had 6 legs instead of 4, and their fur was silver blue like moonlight on water. Their eyes were huge and luminous and filled with fear. They pressed against each other at the back of the den and watched her with those glowing eyes and made soft whimpering sounds. Wolf cubs. The database had mentioned wolves, large predators, pack hunters, dangerous to humans. But these were just bobbies. Grace looked around the den and saw things that made her heart sink. There were claw marks on the roots, big ones. There was dried blood on the leaves nearby. Something had attacked this place. Something had fought here, and the mother of these cubs had lost that fight. These bobbies were orphans. They were alone, and if Grace left them here they would die. The largest cub growled at her. It was trying to be brave. It was trying to protect its siblings even though it was just a baby itself. The middle cub watched her with careful, intelligent eyes that seemed to be measuring her, and the smallest cub just kept crying. It was so thin. They were all so thin. How long had they been here without food? How long had they been waiting for a mother who would never come back? Grace knew what she should do. She should walk away. She should return to her shelter and survive until rescue came and forget about these alien creatures that were not her responsibility. But when she looked at that smallest cub shaking with fear and hunger, something inside her refused to walk away. She reached her hand slowly into the den. The largest cub snapped at her but missed. The middle cub pressed back against the wall, but the smallest one stopped crying. It looked at her hand for a long moment. Then it crawled forward on its 6 tiny legs and pressed its nose against her palm. Its fur was softer than anything Grace had ever touched. Its nose was cold and wet, and when it looked up at her with those huge luminous eyes, she felt something click into place in her chest. Something that felt like purpose. The other 2 cubs watched their sibling nuzzle against this strange creature. The middle one tilted its head as if thinking. Then it too moved forward and sniffed at Grace's fingers. The largest one held back the longest, but finally even it crept close enough to touch her. Grace did not move, she barely breathed. These alien bobbies were choosing to trust her. They were choosing her. The sun set completely and the forest grew dark and cold. Grace could not leave them here. She could not carry them all. So she did the only thing she could think of. She crawled into the den with them. It was cramped and it smelled like animals and dirt, but it was warmer than outside. The cubs pressed against her immediately. They buried their faces in her jacket and curled their 6-legged bodies around her arms, and within minutes they were asleep. The smallest one had its head on her chest right over her heart. Grace lay in the darkness of an alien den on an alien moon thousands of light years from home, with 3 orphaned wolf cubs sleeping against her body. She had broken every rule in the manual. She had made a choice that could complicate everything. But as she felt those small, warm bodies rise and fall with each breath, she knew she had made the right choice. These cubs needed someone to protect them, and whether they knew it or not, they had picked her for the job. She would not let them down. Grace woke up on the second day with 3 warm bodies pressed against her and sunlight filtering through the gaps in the den. The cubs were already awake. They were watching her with those big luminous eyes and waiting for her to move. When she sat up, they sat up too. When she stretched her arms, they stretched their 6 legs. It was like they were learning from her, like they wanted to be just like her. She named them that morning. The largest one with the brave growl became Storm. The middle one with the thoughtful eyes became Luna, and the smallest one who had trusted her first became Pip. They seemed to understand their names. When she said Storm, the big one would look at her. When she said Luna, the middle one would tilt her head. And when she said Pip, the little one would come running on those tiny legs and press against her hand. Grace shared her breakfast ration with them. It was protein paste meant for humans, but the cubs ate it like it was the best thing they had ever tasted. They were so hungry. She could feel their ribs when she touched them. She would need to find more food soon. Her rations would not last long if she was feeding 4 mouths instead of 1. The wrist scanner helped her find plants that were safe to eat. Some kind of purple fruit grew on the lower branches of the big trees, and the cubs seemed to know it was good. They led her to a bush full of berries that her scanner confirmed were safe. They showed her a patch of roots that could be dug up and eaten raw. These bobbies knew their forest. They just needed someone to help them survive in it. On the 3rd day, Grace noticed something strange. The cubs were not just following her anymore. They were copying her behavior. When she walked the perimeter of their camp in the morning, they walked with her. When she sat down to watch the forest, they sat beside her and watched too. When she checked the sky for rescue ships, they looked up as well. But there was more. Luna had started bringing Grace small objects, stones and leaves, and once a pretty feather from some alien bird. She would drop them at Grace's feet and look up expectantly, and Grace realized the cub was giving her gifts. Storm had started positioning himself between Grace and any sound that came from the forest. He was protecting her, and Pip never left her side, not for a moment. The tiny cub slept against her chest and followed at her heels, and made soft, happy sounds whenever Grace touched her fur. These were not just animals. Grace was a She had studied dozens of alien species. She knew the difference between instinct and intelligence, and what she was seeing in these cubs was not instinct. She started keeping notes on her wrist device. She recorded their behaviors. She documented their communication. The cubs made different sounds for different things. A low rumble meant danger. A high chirp meant food. A soft purring sound meant they were happy. They were talking to each other. They were talking to her. And day by day Grace was learning to understand them. The fourth night everything changed. Grace was sitting by a small fire she had built from fallen branches. The cubs were curled around her in their usual positions. Storm at her back watching the darkness. Luna at her side with her head on Grace's leg. Pip in her lap sleeping deeply. The stars were bright above the purple canopy, and Grace was thinking about home when she saw something move in the trees. Eyes, many eyes. They caught the firelight and glowed red in the darkness. Storm felt it first. He stood up and his fur rose along his spine, and that brave little growl came from his throat. Luna woke instantly and pushed against Grace's leg. Pip whimpered and pressed closer to her chest. Predators, the same ones that had killed their mother. Grace stood slowly. She put Pip down behind her and drew her sidearm, the eyes in the darkness. She counted 6 pairs, maybe more. They were circling her camp. They were testing her. One of them stepped into the edge of the firelight and Grace saw what she was facing. It was like a hyena but bigger, much bigger. Its body was covered in black scales instead of fur, and its mouth was full of teeth like broken glass. It looked at her and made a sound like laughter. Grace fired into the air. The sound was enormous in the quiet forest. The creatures scattered back into the darkness, but they did not leave. She could still see their eyes out there, waiting. They knew she could not stay awake forever. They knew they only had to be patient. She looked down at the cubs. They were terrified. They were pressed against her legs and shaking. They knew what those creatures were. They had probably watched those creatures kill their mother. Something hard and cold settled in Grace's chest. It was not fear. It was something else, something older, something that came from deep inside her where her training and her protocols could not reach. These cubs were hers now. She had fed them and named them and held them through cold nights. She had felt their hearts beat against her body. She had watched them learn and grow and trust her. And she would die before she let anything hurt them. Grace did not sleep that night. She kept the fire burning high and her weapon ready. The predators tested her 3 more times. Each time she drove them back. Each time they retreated a little further. By morning they were gone. The cubs looked at her differently after that. There was something new in their eyes, something that looked like awe, like respect, like love. On the 5th morning, Grace heard the sound she had been waiting for, a ship's engine in the sky above the trees. She looked up and saw a shuttle descending through the purple canopy. Rescue had finally come. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt fear. What would happen to the cubs now? What would the rescue team want to do with 3 alien creatures that had no place on a human ship? Storm pressed against her leg. Luna sat at her feet and looked up at her with those thoughtful eyes. Pip climbed into her arms and buried her face in Grace's jacket. They knew something was coming. They knew things were about to change. And they made it clear with every touch and every sound that they were not leaving her side. Grace held them close and watched the shuttle land in the clearing nearby. Whatever happened next, she would fight for them. She would protect them. They had chosen her, and she had chosen them right back. That was the only thing that mattered now. The shuttle door opened, and 3 people stepped out into the purple light of 4. Grace recognized them immediately. Commander Bradley was in front with his gray hair and serious face. Behind him came Cole, the security officer, with her sharp eyes and the weapon on her hip. And last was Dr. Victor Lane, the ship's xenobiology specialist who had been Grace's mentor since she joined the crew. They stopped when they saw her. They stopped because she was not alone. Commander Bradley's hand moved to his sidearm. Cole raised her weapon halfway. Only Dr. Lane stepped forward with curiosity instead of fear on his face. Grace stood her ground. Storm was at her back growling softly. Luna was at her side watching the strangers with careful eyes, and Pip was in her arms pressed against her chest and shaking with fear. Dr. Lane spoke first. He said those are wolves. He said the database lists them as dangerous predators. He asked Grace what she was doing with 3 of their young. Grace told them everything. She told them about the crash and the crying in the forest. She told them about finding the den and the blood and the claw marks. She told them about the cubs choosing to trust her when they had every reason to run away. She told them about 5 days of survival and the predators in the night and the gifts Luna brought her every morning. Commander Bradley listened with a face like stone. When Grace finished, he shook his head. He said the protocol was clear. Wild alien young could not be brought aboard the ship. They could carry diseases. They could grow up to be dangerous. They could cause problems that the crew was not prepared to handle. He said Grace would have to leave them behind. Grace felt something cold spread through her chest. She looked down at Pip in her arms. The little cub was watching the commander with those huge eyes. She was trembling. She knew somehow that this man wanted to take her away from the only safety she had ever known. Grace said no. The commander's eyes went hard. He said that was not a request. He said it was an order. He said Grace would return to the ship and the cubs would stay here where they belonged. Cole was still holding her weapon halfway up. Her eyes moved between Grace and the cubs. She was watching them, measuring them, trying to understand what she was seeing. Storm stepped forward. He positioned himself between Grace and the commander. He was just a baby, but he stood tall and his growl was steady. He was protecting her. This tiny alien creature was ready to face down a ship's commander to keep his humans safe. Something changed in Cole's face. She lowered her weapon completely. She said, "Wait." The commander turned to her with anger in his eyes but was not looking at him. She was looking at Luna. The middle cub had picked up a small purple flower from the ground. She walked forward slowly and carefully until she was standing in front of. Then she dropped the flower at the security officer's feet and looked up at her with those thoughtful eyes. A gift. Luna was giving a gift just like she gave Grace gifts every morning. Knelt down slowly. She picked up the flower and looked at it. Then she looked at Luna and her hard face softened. She said these are not just animals. She said she had seen a lot of creatures in her years of service. She said she knew the difference between instinct and intelligence, and what she was seeing here was not instinct. Dr. Lane moved closer to examine the cubs. His scientific mind was already working. He said the old survey data was incomplete. He said no one had ever studied the wolves closely. He said this could be a major discovery. He said these cubs might be as intelligent as any species in the Galactic Compact. Commander Bradley looked at his team. His security officer was defending the cubs. His science officer wanted to study them, and his was standing there with steel in her eyes ready to fight for 3 alien bobbies she had known for less than a week. He sighed. He said this was going to cause problems. He said there would be questions and paperwork and regulations. He said Grace was responsible for whatever happened. Grace said she understood. She said she accepted that responsibility. She said she would not leave them behind. The commander nodded slowly. He turned back toward the shuttle and told them to load up. He said they were bringing the cubs. Grace felt tears sting her eyes. She knelt down and Storm and Luna crowded against her. She whispered to them that it was okay. She told them they were coming with her. They were safe. They started walking toward the shuttle. Pip was still in Grace's arms. Storm walked at her side watching everything with suspicious eyes. Luna followed close behind, checking over her shoulder at the forest that had been their whole world until now. Then Luna stopped. She went rigid. Her ears went flat against her head and a low growl built in her throat. Grace turned to look. Something was moving in the trees at the edge of the clearing. Something big. Something that was not the predators from before. Commander Bradley saw it too. He shouted for everyone to get to the shuttle. Cole raised her weapon and moved to cover their retreat. But more shapes appeared. They came out of the trees all around the clearing. They moved fast and they moved together, and within seconds Grace and her people were surrounded. They were not animals. They were people, tall and covered in scales with cold yellow eyes and weapons in their clawed hands. 7 of them. They spread out in a circle and blocked every path to the shuttle. One of them stepped forward. He was bigger than the others and there were scars on his face. He looked at Grace and then at the cubs in her arms and at her feet. He smiled with a mouth full of sharp teeth. He said they had been looking for those cubs for a long time. He said their mother had been difficult to kill. He said the cubs would make excellent merchandise on the black market. He said the humans could walk away. All they had to do was leave the cubs behind. Grace looked at Pip trembling in her arms. She looked at Storm trying to be brave at her side. She looked at Luna pressed against her legs. She looked back at the alien and felt that cold, hard thing in her chest turn to fire. She said no. The alien laughed. It was an ugly sound that echoed through the purple forest. He looked at Grace like she was a small insect that had just tried to bite him. He said humans were always so stubborn. He said they never knew when to walk away. He said this was going to be very easy. Commander Bradley stepped forward with his hands raised. He said there was no need for violence. He said they could talk about this. He said maybe they could reach an agreement. The alien raised his weapon and fired. The shot hit Dr. Lane in the shoulder. The scientist cried out and fell to the ground, clutching the wound. Blood seeped between his fingers. Cole was beside him in an instant, trying to stop the bleeding. The alien smiled again. He said that was for wasting his time with talking. He said the next shot would be for the head. He said give him the cubs now. Grace looked at Dr. Lane on the ground. She looked at Cole trying to save him. She looked at Commander Bradley standing helpless with his hands still raised. These hunters were not going to negotiate. They were not going to show mercy. They would kill everyone here and take the cubs and sell them to some collector who would keep them in cages for the rest of their lives. Something snapped inside Grace. Something that had been building since she first heard those cubs crying in the dark. Something ancient and fierce that had nothing to do with protocols or training or the rules of civilized society. She handed Pip to Commander Bradley. She told him to protect them. Then she drew her sidearm and stepped forward. The alien tilted his head. He seemed amused. He said 1 human female against 7 warriors. He said this would be entertaining. Cole stood up beside Grace. Her weapon was in her hand and her eyes were cold. She said make that 2 human females. Commander Bradley put Pip down gently with the other cubs. He told them to stay. Then he drew his own weapon and moved to stand with his crew. He said make that 2 human females and 1 very angry commander. They stopped smiling. They had expected easy prey. They had expected soft scientists who would surrender at the first sign of violence. They had not expected this. Cole moved first. She had been special forces before she joined the research fleet. She knew how to fight. She knew how to kill. And right now she was looking at 7 beings who had just shot her colleague and threatened innocent children. She fired twice, and 2 fell before the others even knew what was happening. Then she was moving. She rolled behind a fallen log and fired again. Another screamed and dropped his weapon. Commander Bradley was not as fast, but he was steady. He had fought in the border wars 20 years ago. He knew how to stay calm when weapons were firing. He picked his targets and he did not miss. Grace was neither a soldier nor a fighter, but she had spent 5 days protecting 3 helpless cubs from everything this moon could throw at her. She had stared down predators in the darkness. She had gone without sleep and without food and without hope, and she had survived. The alien came for her directly. He was fast and he was strong, and he wanted to make an example of this human who had dared to defy him. He swung his weapon at her head. Grace ducked under the blow. She remembered the hand-to-hand training from her academy days. She remembered the moves she had practiced 1,000 times and never thought she would use. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. She hit him 3 times, throat, eyes, knee. He staggered back, gasping for air, and she hit him again, and again, and again. The alien fell to the ground. He looked up at her with shock in his yellow eyes. He had not expected this. None of them had expected this. The fight lasted less than 2 minutes. When it was over, 5 were down. The remaining 2 looked at their fallen comrades and looked at the 3 humans standing over them, and they ran. They disappeared into the forest and did not look back. Grace stood there breathing hard with blood on her knuckles that was not her own. Her hands were shaking. Her whole body was shaking. She had never done anything like that in her life. Then she heard a sound behind her, a soft chirping sound. She turned around. The cubs were watching her. Storm and Luna and Pip. They had seen everything. They had watched their human stand against impossible odds and win. They had watched her fight for them when any sane person would have given up. Pip walked forward on her little legs. She pressed her nose against Grace's hand the same way she had done in the den that first night. Storm moved to stand beside Grace and pressed his shoulder against her leg. Luna came last. She sat at Grace's feet and looked up at her with those thoughtful eyes and made a sound Grace had never heard before. It was not a purr, it was not a chirp, it was something else, something that sounded almost like a word. Dr. Lane spoke from where Cole was bandaging his shoulder. His voice was weak, but his eyes were bright with wonder. He said that sound was in the old survey records. He said the researchers who first studied the wolves had heard it only once. He said it was the sound the cubs made for their mother. Grace felt tears running down her face. She knelt down and gathered the cubs in her arms. They pressed against her and made that sound again, that mother sound, that home sound. Commander Bradley holstered his weapon. His face was pale, but there was something like respect in his eyes now. He said they needed to get Dr. Lane to the medical bay. He said they needed to report what had happened here. He said things were going to get complicated. But first he looked at Grace and the cubs huddled around her. He said he was sorry he had tried to make her leave them behind. He said he understood now. They loaded into the shuttle. The cubs stayed pressed against Grace the whole way. When the engines fired and they lifted off from 4, Pip climbed into her lap and watched the forest shrink below them. They were leaving the only home the cubs had ever known. They were flying toward an uncertain future full of questions and challenges. But they were together, and that was all that mattered. 6 months had passed since 4. 6 months of questions and examinations and endless reports. 6 months of scientists wanting to study the cubs and politicians wanting to debate what to do with them. 6 months of Grace fighting every single day to keep her family together. The cubs had grown. They were not Bobbies anymore. Storm was nearly as tall as Grace's waist now. His silver-blue fur had darkened and his eyes had lost that puppy roundness. But he still positioned himself between Grace and any stranger who came too close. He still growled at anyone who looked at her wrong. Luna had grown elegant and careful. She watched everything with those thoughtful eyes, and she seemed to understand things that no one had taught her. Dr. Lane had spent months studying her. He said her brain structure was more complex than any species he had ever encountered. He said she was learning human language faster than should be possible. And Pip, little Pip, who had been the smallest and the weakest. She had grown strong, but she was still Grace's shadow. She still slept at the foot of Grace's bed every night. She still pressed against her leg whenever Grace sat down. She still made that soft, happy sound whenever Grace touched her fur. They were standing now in the Great Hall of Harmony Prime, the Galactic Council Chamber. Representatives from 100 worlds sat in curved rows that rose toward a ceiling painted with stars. This was where the laws of the galaxy were made. This was where the future of the cubs would be decided. Grace stood at the speaker's platform with Storm on her left and Luna on her right and Pip pressed against her back. They were not supposed to be here. Animals were not allowed in the council chamber. But the cubs were not animals. That was the whole point. Dr. Lane had submitted his research 3 months ago. Hundreds of pages documenting the intelligence and emotional capacity of the wolves. Brain scans and behavioral studies and recordings of their language. Evidence that could not be ignored. Evidence that proved these creatures were people. The representative rose from his seat. He was not the hunter from the forest, but he had the same cold eyes. He said the cubs were wild animals that belonged to no one. He said the humans had interfered with a lawful hunt. He said they had been harvesting wolves for generations, and they would not stop because of one sentimental human female. Grace felt Storm tense beside her. She put her hand on his head and he settled. He trusted her. They all trusted her. The council chair asked Grace to speak. She stepped forward to the center of the platform and looked out at the sea of alien faces watching her. She told them about the crash. She told them about hearing the crying in the dark and following it to a den full of orphaned bobbies. She told them about the choice she made that first night when she could have walked away and did not. She told them about 5 days alone on an alien moon with 3 cubs who had every reason to fear her but chose to trust her instead. She told them about Pip pressing her nose against Grace's hand in the darkness. She told them about Luna bringing gifts every morning. She told them about Storm standing guard over his sisters and his human with nothing but a baby's growl and a baby's courage. She told them about the predators in the night and the hunters in the clearing. She told them about fighting for these cubs when the smart thing would have been to give up. She told them about the sound the cubs made when the fight was over. The mother sound. The home sound. Then she said something that made the whole chamber go quiet. She said protection was not about ownership. She said it was not about rights or regulations or what the law allowed. She said protection was about love. It was about seeing something small and helpless and scared, and deciding that you would stand between it and every danger in the universe no matter the cost. She said these cubs did not belong to her. She did not own them, but she loved them, and they loved her, and that bond was more real than any contract or any law. The representative tried to interrupt. He said this was ridiculous. He said humans were sentimental fools who let their emotions cloud their judgment. Luna stepped forward. She walked to the center of the platform and looked up at the representative with those calm, thoughtful eyes. And then she spoke. Her voice was strange and soft. Her mouth was not made for human words, but the word she said was clear enough for everyone to hear. She said, "Mother." The chamber erupted. Delegates were shouting and pointing, and the representative was screaming that it was a trick. But Grace was not listening to any of them. She was looking at Luna, who had just spoken her first human word. She was looking at Storm, who was standing proud beside his sister. She was looking at Pip, who had tears in her eyes just like Grace did. The council chair called for order. It took several minutes for the chamber to quiet down. Then she called for the vote. The decision was unanimous. The wolves were recognized as a sentient species under galactic law. They could not be hunted or sold or kept as property. And Grace was formally recognized as the guardian of Luna and Storm, and Pip under the protection statutes that applied to all sentient young. The cubs were hers, legally and officially and forever. They walked out of the council chamber together. The corridors of Harmony Prime stretched before them, full of aliens and humans and possibilities. Reporters tried to ask questions. Politicians tried to shake hands. Grace ignored them all. She found a quiet alcove near a window that looked out at the stars. She sat down on a bench, and the cubs gathered around her the way they always did. Storm at her back watching for threats. Luna at her side with her head on Grace's leg. Pip in her lap with her face buried in Grace's jacket. Grace looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there was 4 in its purple forests in the den where she had found 3 orphaned bobbies crying in the dark. That felt like a lifetime ago. That felt like yesterday. She had come to space to study alien life. She had never expected alien life to adopt her. She had never expected to become a mother to 3 wolf cubs from a distant moon. But here she was, here they were, a family. Luna made a soft sound and pressed closer. Storm rumbled contentedly behind her. Pip was already falling asleep in her lap the way she did every night. Grace smiled and held them close. The universe was strange and dangerous and full of wonders she had never imagined. But she was not facing it alone. She had her cubs. She had her family. And that was everything.